We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service.
Welcome to this episode of the PA Path Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lohenry, and we are glad you can join us as we seek to better understand the PA profession.
Don't be afraid of it, understand it, and understand when you're being fed AI.
Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 64. Today we speak with Dr. Arta Bakshandeh. Dr. Bakshandeh is the Chief Medical Informatics Officer at Alignment Healthcare, a population health management company that partners with health systems and provider groups across the country to improve the health of seniors. Dr. Bakshandeh is a friend to the profession. He is married to a PA. He has many PAs in his family. He has been a PA educator at the University of Southern California's PA school and is a preceptor for many schools as well in the past. And he has a particular expertise in the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. So we certainly look forward to hearing from Dr. Bakshandeh today. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. As you know, this topic, I was just looking through the text from Anthony Chang. This is a huge topic to talk about in 45 minutes. So we won't be able to scratch the surface very much, but I thought we could just kind of, talk a little bit about how you got into medicine, how you got into AI, its use cases that you've experienced personally, and kind of what you see as the argument for PA education to be preparing students and faculty to be ready to use AI as a tool down the road so that we can kind of put our pitch in.
Yeah.
Because the audience is mostly applicants and educators. There's some clinical types as well, but I think that would be really helpful.
People ask me for, kind of guidance on should they go to medical school? Should they go to PA school, do it? And they ask me, why'd you become a doctor? And I always say it kind of chose me in a way. And I think you and I have talked about this in the past is I've just had experiences in my life where, kind of thought to myself, I think for whatever reason, things happen around me and I maybe call it my situational awareness. They probably happen around everybody, but I'm like, okay, well, that person needs help and no one's helping them. It should probably be me because it feels good when I do that. So let me do that. And it's more than just, wanting to help people. Patients typically are in a vulnerable, situation. But things I'm talking about are, this happened actually with one of your graduating classes. A lot of the girls were over, Catherine, my wife is a PA, and she, they were over just after graduation, and my neighbor fell off the roof. And I heard it, and I remember looking up, and all the girls looked at me, and they're like, "What was that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you heard it too?" I don't know. And we heard a moan, and I just jumped over our 8-foot tall brick wall. And he was down. He had a pelvic fracture. He had a Colles fracture, and they're all peeking over. I'm like, I need 2 of you to come over here and help me stabilize him. Someone else call 911. This is what we're going to do, and kind of walk through it. And he ended up doing okay, but it's kind of situations like that. It's odd. It happens to me a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really why I decided medicine was my route. Plus, I enjoy being an educator. I feel like medicine is really something that you have to continue to learn, but it's something that you have to teach. And it's been a blessing that I think I have. I've had the intelligence to be able to continue through it.
Yeah.
Through clinical practice, through going through things like not fellowship, but residency, and then going into kind of the chronic disease management programs I went into, which felt like a fellowship, and meeting a fellow clinician at a AI conference, in 2015. That was kind of where my eyes opened up, that we were coming out of this AI winter, if you will, of, really for the last 20, 30 years, it was rules-based algorithms, and that was AI. AI was rules. It's like if then this, okay, trigger. And we were starting to advance in not only our ability to have large amounts of stored data for, cheap, very cheap, kind of financially very cheap. And then these new technologies starting to come out, like we went from random forest to like XGBoost or neural networks, and that quickly turned to convolutional neural networks. And what you could do with that, Dr. Anthony Chang, who's the head of AI Med, and he's a pediatric cardiologist at Children's Hospital in Orange County, who decided to go back to school and get his master's degree in data science, and that was very inspirational to me because it was what I was tasked to do around that time, to start building kind of these clinical informatics, understanding of what's going to happen with patients in the next 30 days or next year. And I began to kind of follow his path. I didn't go back to school, but a lot of reading. I joined different organizations, including MI3 and AI Med, and was lucky enough to start to work hand in hand with data scientists to build these algorithms. And I think that, some of it was right place at the right time. Some of it was my own curiosity. And then knowing that I needed to educate myself to a degree that, maybe I'm not going to go get my master's or my PhD in data science. But I would argue to anyone who's listening, you don't have to do that, because we're in a place where, what medicine needs is a clinician in the loop. It needs a human in the loop. And that human should be the clinician, because we have the context, we understand the workflow, we understand the patient dynamics, we are patients ourselves often. And AI doesn't have that context. And it won't for a very long time, no matter what anyone tries to convince you. We're not close to artificial general intelligence. You can read a number of books. A very dense book, but a good one is Super Intelligence by Nick Bostrom. That's a book that kind of gives you an idea that we're probably 20 to 100 years away from general intelligence. We just don't understand enough about the human mind to say that we're going to build an AI, or an AI will be built in the kind of aura of a human. Is it smarter generally than a rat? Probably. But that's not what we consider general intelligence.
Right.
I gave you a very long-winded answer.
No, that's fine. Because so when you left med school and residency, you started off in internal medicine. Did you start as a hospitalist right away?
I did. Yeah, I did. So I worked for a company called CareMore, which Anthem acquired. And the idea in that group was, if you treat the patient, the money will follow. And I liked that, because it wasn't a let's burn and churn. How many RVUs are you going to get? I don't need to see 100 people in a day. It was a pay attention to what the patient needs, envelop them with care, provide them chronic disease management. So we had care centers that would bring patients in for like a diabetes clinic. They had MAs that were trained to cut, the toenails. And so, a lot of people would come in and get their toenails cut at the clinic, specifically our diabetics. We would have we had a heart failure clinic. We had remote patient monitoring back then. And, really you saw these KPIs that we would look at, like, admissions of the COPD population. Mm-hmm. I remember it was, because I would present it a lot of times, it was 40 to 42% lower than the industry average. Heart failure patients, 30% lower than the industry average in terms of, hospitalizations.
Which has real world money attached to that if you're keeping them out of the hospital.
Yeah. And more than the money, it's, this is your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa that's not going to the hospital, right? And this is you not having the anxiety that my mom, my dad, my grandma, my grandpa.
Sure. And the productivity, right? For you as a human.
It's bigger than just the financial aspect of it. But of course we have to focus on that, because, right, you have to keep the lights on and keep that clinical model going.
Sure.
And my progression to alignment was actually our previous founder, our co-founder of CareMore, the previous CMO of CareMore, and the previous CEO of CareMore, that got together and said, hey, job's not done. Let's build this with data. And, they recruited me to come in and kind of build that data part and say, look, we had data more timely, more actionable. Could we, in fact, do better than what we were doing, at CareMore? And that thesis held true. Our admissions per thousand in Medicare are running in the 150s to low 160s, where Millman states, well managed, Medicare population should be around the 200 range admissions per thousand, and fee for service is, depending on the market, is around 225 to 250. So if you think about that delta, we're almost 100. It's like 40%, 40% less than Medicare fee for service. That's real dollars, but those are real people.
Right.
And it's the hospital, not decreasing hospitalizations because you're actually caring for people is what we all went to school for. Right.
Give me one sec, because I want to just talk about that. Maybe the counter argument that I could envision coming out is, what is the difference in investments that Alignment Healthcare has made to get to that number versus maybe a more traditional health system? Because I just presume that the investment of AI and data analytics and the people you need to bring in, it's going to cost a little bit more to get there, but is that still a significant cost savings?
Yes. So it is definitely costly to get there in terms of building that infrastructure. But I think where we were lucky was even though we did spend quite a bit, is we were smaller and we had the ability to make a decision of, hey, if we're going to do this, we need to do this now, because it'll be near impossible. So you can see that a lot of the bigger players are having issues with this because they have such a tremendous amount of data, right? They're still band-aiding things together.
They can't even get their health record system set up.
No. And a lot of that's because they're still working and relying on these kind of archaic data architectures. We built in cloud, we built, and engineers for cloud engineering, building cloud products, not cheap, but we built in cloud. We migrated our legacy systems into cloud. We transfer, you have an enterprise data warehouse that's inside of the cloud as opposed to a SQL server, which if anyone's ever queried a SQL server, it's like a giant Excel document. And if you have too many lines that you're querying, it's going to crash just like Excel does.
Sure.
The nice thing about a cloud architecture is you don't have to worry about that. The factory scales itself up when it has a lot to do, and it scales itself down when it doesn't.
Nice.
And, doing that allowed us to start not only having a better line of sight to the data and actionability of the data, but it was then bringing on data scientists to be able to use things like, Databricks and these different virtual machines where they could build AI algorithms that would in turn, be able to give us the outputs we needed. And a lot of that conversation around the cost was, of course, ROI. Like, what's the return on investment of having an artificial intelligence? And the first use case was that of admissions. And, I approached our CEO council and said, I think if we can understand that who the patients are that are likely to be admitted in the next 30 days, and we take, the very top 10% of them, and we provide them with 24/7 access to care, and a nurse practitioner or a PA going into the home or virtually seeing them, at any time of day, then I think, and to augment the primary care physician, I think we can drive down admissions. There's the cost of those FTEs, right?
Sure.
But I bet you, and this is the projections, I worked with the actuarial team, that if we can predict this many and decrease this many admissions, we're going to save X amount of dollars. And essentially it was a gamble, I think, on the side of our CEO council to say yes. But when we did it, we were running in the 180s, 180 admissions per thousand, 185 admissions per thousand.
Mm-hmm.
Last 3.5 years, we've been around average 155 in that cohort. That delta of 30 admissions per thousand, when the average admission costs us about $14,500.
Yeah.
That's big money.
Yeah.
So you look at the cost curve bend, and we're a publicly traded company, so this is all public information that I'm stating. Is you look at some of the analysis that we put out there. It's it's about a 30% cost delta and 20% cost savings. Meaning, if you left the patient population alone in that same cohort, or similar cohort, what happens to them, watching what happens to them financially versus when we're involved, that delta is about 30%. And then, but the cost savings, from the access of zero is 21%.
And again, from an economic perspective, the cost savings that you're describing, the $14K per person average, that's not including quality of life measures, the productivity of that individual society. Yeah, that's just dollars for the company that is providing the care for them, the insurance company.
Yeah, and what people don't actually understand about like Medicare Advantage is, so, okay, let's say I save $1 million. I can only keep 15% of it. So $850,000 actually has to go back to benefits for the patient. A lot, they're like, oh, and that's something that I'm seeing today in the conversation around, Medicare Advantage, and they're making all this money and this, that, and the other. And it's like, yeah, but wait a minute, you don't understand how this works. Is we're making money, right? But we're only keeping 15% of what we're making.
Yeah.
We're actually giving back 85% to things like, benefits like transportation. We put $100 on a tangible debit card that you can use for groceries. So we're tackling social determinants of health. And that's why I love being where I am in a clinically led organization where, we saw these things. I've seen this forever. We've talked about this for years, right? Is, somebody doesn't have food. Why can't we help them get that food? So we have things like Meals on Wheels, right? We do that.
Right.
But maybe they need a little bit of extra cash. Health insurers aren't used to doing that. But we said a couple of years back, I sat down with our product team and a couple other physicians, colleagues of mine that share the same kind of worldview of, hey, we, part of the benefit should be, let's give them $100 back for groceries. Let's give them, $100 for over the counters, like Tylenol, ibuprofen, because you and I've been in that situation where we tell a patient in the clinic, like, hey, you know what, just go take some Dulcolax and some Senna and you'll be okay. You can buy it over the counter, and then they don't fill it and they show up again. And then you say, well, why are you here? Like, well, sorry, I didn't tell you I couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
The luxury I have is I say, that little black card you got in your pocket, you've got $20 on there.
Yeah.
What you use it for. Go get that Senna, or, that Colace that you need, or whatever it might be. And so I think it's, having those data points as well, helps us better treat the population.
Yeah. So in your role now, so you are the Chief Medical Informatics Officer for Alignment Healthcare. Originally was a private entity. You guys went public a couple of years ago?
Yeah, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay. And I want to say before I get lost in this, congrats on your nomination from AI Med for the Champion Clinician of the Year. That's really impressive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was kind of a surprise. It's an honor.
You've been singing.
Even be recognized.
Yeah. Well, you've been singing on the Squire sheet for a long time. I mean, you were way ahead of the curve for anybody at Keck that I knew. So let's talk about, for the general listener who are typically students and educators, what is the key impact of AI for the care that you're providing currently in the patients that are within your purview?
It's multifactorial, but because there's so many different models. So we've implemented 170 machine learning models, all explainable across our ecosystem. Some of them are looking at general risk, like what's the risk of this person being admitted? What's the readmission risk? What is, the likelihood that their CHF is going to deregulate, or they're going to, what's the likelihood they're going to end up on dialysis? So I think there's a number of those. And then there's some non-clinical, which I don't think, for the sake of this conversation, are as important. And then what we don't use, but I think is still worth bringing up, are things like in the radiology space. We're seeing a lot of use of artificial intelligence in radiology today around things like reading chest X-rays, reading a CT scan, an MRI, and helping the workflow of the radiologist there. And I think then the other big piece that we're seeing and that we're building right now is the GPT-3, GPT-4, ChatGPTs, and kind of open. Like OpenAI and others, these large language models, which we can have a discussion about as well on how good or bad are they. But we're looking at it under the lens of it needs guardrails. We need to make sure that the ChatGPT is reined in and isn't free to say whatever it wants. It's also important what data it has access to, because if you use something like an OpenAI today, it has access to everything right and wrong, and it can't reason through it.
Right.
I had a meeting last week with the head of Microsoft's ethics division in AI and their lead of their OpenAI, and it was about 50 CTOs, CIOs from different companies. And we had kind of like a lunch and learn with them and got to ask questions. And what's funny is this person from Microsoft, she goes, look, ChatGPT is a good confabulator. It's really good at it. And if you call it on it, it'll tell you, oh, well, I just didn't know the answer, so I just said that. And that in itself is pretty dangerous when you're talking about patient care. So I know I went on a bit of a tangent in terms of my answer. So we're working on that, but in just to give you kind of a concrete, what did we do? What was successful? Admission model, wildly successful, I think, in terms of clear. Our readmission model, it has little over 1,000 attributes. It's run on multiple times during the day. As soon as someone's discharged, it's run. It doesn't use the hospital EHR. So what happened to that person in the EHR? It's using over 1,000 other attributes of this person, including social determinants, who they are. And it's outperforming the LACE score by an average of 17%.
For our audience, what's the LACE score?
So the LACE score is an industry standard tool that's a rules-based algorithm that looks at things like, length of stay, admitting diagnoses, discharge disposition, level of care, number of things to basically give a hospital system a likelihood of a readmission. And it's used at hospitals all over the country. We used it at USC when I was a resident. They still use it at, everywhere I go. And we're consistently outperforming it without even that hospital data. And so I always talk to my colleagues about, hey, you got to get your hospital, to connect and build one with the hospital data, because I bet you it's going to be way better than mine. But it's at least helping me better identify who case management needs to go see, who maybe I need to send a PA into the home, and it also triages the patient within the system that we've built, that if that high risk of readmission calls, it actually routes to the PA on call, or the physician on call, or the case manager on call, depending on what the reasoning is for.
Okay.
And so that's instead of sending them to like Teladoc or MD Live or one of those telehealth platforms, because as great as they are, that virtual urgent care, I don't think is set up or equipped for, a chronically frail, patient who was just discharged from the hospital.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to the old school days when I was doing hospital work, and you get somebody that was just discharged from a different provider that ends up in your office. And if you don't have access to that H&P and the discharge summary and kind of the daily notes, and if the patient's not a great historian, you're just kind of trying to figure things out through a lot of misinformation. And frankly, you just start all over and try to create a better sense of the picture yourself. But it sounds like what you've set up with your parameters is your folks are getting really accurate information and a clear picture of the risk, so you can do the things you need to do to avoid readmission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be clear, so it's a triage. In a way, it's a triaging tool, right? Just like we've used before. We're not denying anybody care. Everybody gets on that list, high to low gets a phone call. They all get case management, but it's kind of, where do you start? Because you certainly don't start alphabetically. I think what AI is doing for us and will do for us is help scale. It's going to change some industries. It's going to change some of how we practice medicine. But I would tell the students and just the listeners of the podcast is, you don't be afraid of it, understand it, and understand when you're being fed AI. I was at a Reuters conference a couple of days ago. I was speaking in regards to actioning, AI, actioning data and insight into insights. And one of the things, someone came up to me and said, I'm terrified of AI. I think it's, I don't know how we're going to use this clinically. I don't think we should. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. You ever used UpToDate? And they're like, yeah, I use update all the time. I'm like, what about Hippocrates? He's like, oh, yeah, I totally use Hippocrates. I'm like, how do you use it? He just grabs his iPhone out of his pocket. And I was like, huh, okay. And so I kind of looked at him, and at that split second, he was putting his phone away, and then he got a ding, and he immediately brought it up to his face. And I said, so what I've just observed is you actually have a symbiotic relationship with AI. You're just not understanding that yet. And it's kind of like oh. And so we started to talk more and more. I started to talk to him about, think about how these algorithms are working and the AI that you are interacting with, you're comfortable with. So what's the real conversation we need to have is trust. And how do you build the trust that you need for the AI? And it's really understanding where the AI is coming from, or that you are using AI in that moment. So when you're in a clinical workflow and you're going through, let's say, what do I need to do next for this person? This quality measure pops up and it says, hey, you should do this. Was it a rule, or was it AI that's saying, hey, I'm identifying something? And then the ability to kind of hover over it and say, okay, this is the training set it was trained on. This is the reason why it's telling me that. Explainability plus understanding, I think, is going to build the trust, but also is something that we should be questioning, because AI can be built with tremendous bias. And understanding the data set is incredibly important, because you can't, at least in the US models right now, majority of these risk-based models the training data is from the West Coast or the East Coast.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing in, rural Idaho or Iowa, or the middle of Texas. It's different. Some of the features and during your feature importance stage of, building an AI, sure, you might have something that's the same, but it's not reproducible. And you can't just take a model and pop it somewhere else. What you need to do is train on the data from that area. So like if I have a model that's really working really well in California, I can take those same parameters, look at them in feature importance in a place like, let's say, Iowa, but I may find that there are other features that are more important, and that, that the AI will say, you know what, those things that were important in California, they don't really apply here. There are some other things that they're capturing. But the data that you need, to be successful in that, you need a couple of years of data from, the population in Iowa to say that, yes, that's what I'm going to do for this, this population and create an AI. So I think that's an important key piece of understanding too, is kind of, where did this come from? What is it? Where did you get the data from? And what are the biases inside of it?
If you pay attention to the news, I know you're very busy, but I'm sure you're very keenly aware of the challenges in our country related to DEI and the conversations and the laws that are being put out there in some states to regulate or shut down any kind of DEI conversations. And when I went to the MI meeting with Dr. Chang, a few years ago with you, one of the key messages, you talked about the bias, right? One of the key messages is how important it is to have a diverse group of people around the table, diverse group of people that are trained to do machine learning, deep learning, et cetera. So you just talk a little bit about that concept, and has that changed since I was at that training, or are we seeing more diversity in that, or is it still the same?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's my team is incredibly diverse. I've got, somebody from Cambodia, somebody from Indonesia, somebody from India, somebody from Iran, two people from Europe, and a couple of Americans. So and one South American. So we're kind of, we're not everywhere.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there's not bias, right? The bias largely can live in the data itself.
Sure.
And so we've taken upon it as an organization, but also one of the things that you've heard, like you said, you've heard me speak about bias a lot. I don't want to build a model that has bias in it. So we have to look at a number of things. We look at things like, causality versus correlation. We look at identifying, running other algorithms to identify, things that we know may create some social biases we already remove, but there are proxies for those biases. And you can identify those proxies by running, different types of algorithms to say, oh, wait a minute, that proxy that this is X is a proxy for the patient being, let's say, a Hispanic origin, and that we need to remove that proxy, or we need to make it known, if clinically relevant, that this exists, this bias exists, but we are seeing it, in this demographic more. So, it's a fine line to walk, but it's important to discuss, because if you think about, get out of medicine for a second, there's still, many police departments that are using software of, did this person create actually do the crime or not do the crime, right? And it's based on training data from arrest records. And we all know that in certain areas of the country, if not all, right, there are some biases and racial biases that some more extreme than others that were used for training data. So you've inherently created this environment where the AI is going to express that. Yeah. I think some people are going back to fix it, and I think some people don't realize it's even there.
Yeah. And you talk about the algorithms that you create. How does your team and how do you as a clinician take a look at the output of that algorithm after it's been completed to assess validity, to assess for bias that still might be present?
Yeah, explainable AI is very important. So the ability to have the model explain, why it's saying something. So that's one. Two is, we kind of on the back end create a report card. I just saw a lecture from a gentleman in the U.S. Navy who the VA and the Navy are doing the same thing with creating this report card of kind of, what was the intention of this model? What was the data that was used? How accurate is it? So we look at precision and recall, and that's positive predictive value and sensitivity. And that's a better measure of how, well you're accurately predicting something versus an area under the curve. So you hear a lot of AI companies out there that say, oh, our AUC, area under the curve, is, 83%, 90%. And, we're the best thing since, sliced bread. And my response is, well, what's precision and recall? And they give it to you and it's low. You're like, okay, so your model's not great. You just have a really kind of steep curve that, or a fat curve that allows for a lot of area under it. That means nothing. It's a good way to be tricked. So something I would take away from this discussion is, start asking the hard questions, because the vendors are always going to go to the AUC because it's always a high number and it helps them sell. But in fact, that's not what you should be looking at. What you should be looking at is, how is the precision and recall? Are you actually capturing the output that you want, or else it's not going to be successful.
Yeah. Consistency, validity. Yeah, I get it. Talked earlier about ChatGPT, which is kind of the popular thing these days. I'm sure there'll be lots of other models coming out. But ultimately, I took a dance into ChatGPT this morning just to get a sense as an educator of how I might use it to enhance my job, to make my efficiency improve, to support our students, and also to understand how our students might use it from a perspective of learning, maybe remediation, or of course, every academic out there talks about cheating. And I spit out and I sent this to you earlier, which, we're happy to make available on our website, but I spit out like 3 different questions or directives to the ChatGPT 4.0, which was based on developing learning instructional objectives around hypertension. And then it recommended that I consider doing assessments that are tied to each objective, which is good educational philosophy. So I asked it to put out some assessments for us, and it gave us some multiple choice questions, a short answer form, and a case. And then I also asked it to explain for a learner the physiology of something. I can't remember which topic it was, but ultimately, where do you see PA education being impacted by AI in the classroom? And what are the important features as a clinician that's using this regularly, and as an employer, as you hire PAs down the road? What are the things you think employers are going to want to see that PA schools are preparing students for?
So I think right now, I would not use OpenAI for any kind of medical question, because although it can quote unquote pass the boards, it lacks tremendous context. So if you slapped in a couple of vignettes, I guarantee, with a question at the end, I guarantee you it's probably going to get it wrong. If you throw in something like, what's the most common cause of atrial fibrillation, it'll probably get that right.
Sure.
Because it's simple. But the more complex, it's not great. So let's start with the educator. So what OpenAI and ChatGPTs, allow you to do is build things like a curriculum, put that together. But I still think you need to kind of take a look at it yourself and edit it. Right? You got to fine tune it. It's not going to be completely right, but it's going to definitely help you get the ball rolling. So it'll, you think of it as just another tool in your arsenal that you still need to look over. That's going to help you kind of scale your time and put some of these things together. Right.
Yeah. To that point, Arta, yesterday I asked it to create 15 instructional objectives on heart failure, including pathophysiology, physiology, all the classic things. And with a more descriptive request, it gave me 15, but many of them were duplicative. Yeah. They were kind of covering the same thing. So I see your point. I validate that. Yeah. And today I didn't give it a number. I said, give me instructional objectives in hypertension, and they were pretty shallow. Yeah, it was a good starting point, but they were pretty shallow.
Yeah, and so I think the key message out of that is, right, don't depend entirely on what the answer of the ChatGPT is. You still have to think critically. What I worry is that there will be those who become dependent on whatever ChatGPT says, because ChatGPT is it's such a good confabulator, but it's so convincing that, oh, this is it. It's right. Oh my God, it wrote this in a way that obviously it's correct, but it's, oftentimes it's not. So you still have to have that critical thinking.
Verify and validate.
To verify, right? Verify, validate. And I think to some degree for like the students that are going through it, that verification validation process is actually going to help them learn a little bit more, right? Because they're going to spend that extra time kind of looking to validate. Those that don't, I think, can be harmed, because looking at kind of what you sent, right, the multiple choice questions, interesting, right, and what it came back with, like some of the multiple choice or what are some non-modifiable risk factors for hypertension, right, and gave a couple of things. What's interesting though is that it's not writing the questions in the way that the boards think about it. Right. So I wrote for the boards for a while. I don't currently do that for the NCCPA.
Yeah.
And, I know how we think because I was asked to think that way, and it's changed the way that I think about, taking tests and looking at answers. And there's a very particular way of, there's 4, potential answers. And they're usually all 4 of them are pretty close to being correct, but there's one really correct answer. Where a lot of these answers that come out from ChatGPT there's 3 or 2 obvious that's definitely not right, or but the 2 that maybe, or 1 that's definitely right, and that's not going to be the same way that we you take your boards or I take my boards. So it is important to think about that, but at the same time, where I think is going to get really exciting is if you are able to, and I think we're going to be there very soon, is that you can tell the ChatGPT to close the environment to specific data sources and then create those questions, to create test questions for yourself, right? To start saying, and so you won't need a board review book. You're going to say, hey, ChatGPT, utilize Dynamed, UpToDate, and the CMDT, and write me 10 questions about hypertension. And you're going to get, 10 multiple choice questions on hypertension, and then test yourself. I think we're going to be there soon. But today it's the whole, gamut of what's out there on the internet, and it can't reason through it.
Yeah. It can't verify good versus poor sources. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in that case, it's a little bit, I don't use the word dangerous, but it's not the appropriate place for you to, to learn. I think it can direct you, but I wouldn't solely, bet my board certification on it.
Yeah. So the context of AI in images,
Mhm.
that argument when I was at that training was very clear, right? They were
Yeah.
using the ophthalmology study for retinal changes. They were using which I think was Google, if I'm not
Yeah, it was
mistaken.
Google. Yep.
They were using the pulmonary embolism studies with CT, which I think might have been in Orange County at Chalk or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or UC Irvine, I think. So basically, AI, when you're doing machine learning or deep learning around imagery, highly accurate for the most part. And what it's doing is it's allowing a radiologist to get a note saying urgent. Take a look at this CT first, because we see a high probability of PE, and so they can kind of expedite the urgent cares, the emergent care that is needed. But in terms of all the other aspects of it right now, it's going to be more useful, it sounds like, in predictive modeling, in assessing hospital stays and efficiencies and ways to improve chronic care management, maybe even improve urgent care management down the road in the hospital base. And so PAs basically just need, from your perspective, it sounds like, read up on it, keep up on it, attend conferences so you're still aware of it, and be ready to use it in your practice setting and down the road, because it's coming, but it's not going to take away their jobs.
No. Yeah. It's going to be that extra I always call it the clinician on your shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
It's just another data point that you have in your arsenal and taking care of patients. And what AI should be doing, a good AI is going to help scale you as a clinician. It should be built to help you do your job better, help you do your job faster, right? So like in the case of you were just articulating in regards to radiology, it's bringing it up to the queue, right? Because if we think about how a radiologist reads, they're reading, whatever was done in the order it was done. But if something's bad in number 100, I got to go through 99 things before I get to the bad thing. It just brings it up to the top of the queue for them and points an arrow, to, hey, you got to look at this. There's this there. And I think there's now over 800 FDA approved imaging AIs. So I'm doing cardiology, so things around cardiac MRI, echo, even on reading an EKG. So we've all read an EKG. That old AI was like, STEMI, and you look at the EKG, you go, no, you stupid, like, not right.
Never trusted it.
Tremendously better, at it. And I think it'll be soon that we will have those integrated into our EKG machines. We don't. There are certain, companies that do, that are doing it and starting to integrate, where they're catching, atrial fibrillations, flutters faster than anything else, and able to tell you that that's what it is. They're starting to put them in stethoscopes, where the stethoscope will tell you the murmur. So all great, in terms of tools. We just have to remember that what happens when it doesn't work, right?
Yeah, we still have to
know what we're doing when we, we're taking care of a patient. We can't lose that. And that's a big part of it. You still got to put your hands on patients.
Yeah. And it sounds like from a student perspective, there could be some benefit to helping you build, especially in the next year or two, building test questions to kind of prep for exams or prep for the board exams. But ultimately, they have to remember the board exams are highly proctored. Right. So they're going to have to be able to make the answers on their own without utilizing that. And it also sounds like you might be better off going through a peer-reviewed textbook or journal for evidence-based medicine or practice guidelines at this point than relying on ChatGPT to give you the answers.
Yeah. And just again, to be clear, it's OpenAI is open to everything, right? But if you had an environment that was a ChatGPT that had access to just the closed environment of like
peer-reviewed journals and things,
peer-reviewed journals and that's being built. And, that will be, I think soon what'll happen is you'll have like, up to date, we'll probably end up integrating something like this. Dynamed will end up integrating. And then you ask a question of, what's the most common cause of X? You're not going to have to scroll through the screen to find it. It's just going to tell you, because it's using its data as the only source. It shouldn't be open to everything. It should just be open to kind of that knowledge base that you're looking for.
I will say the one thing I was impressed by is that it did give me a disclaimer. It said, based on information when I last was trained, which is September of 21. And it did encourage me to speak to a healthcare provider, assuming I was a patient looking at information.
But
So there are.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but so 2 years ago, there was a chat GPT that put in theoretical patients, and it told a suicidal patient to kill itself.
I was aware. Yeah.
Yeah. So were you aware that it did it again last week?
No.
Yeah. So even though you sometimes get that disclaimer, it happened again last week. So Microsoft was on this call with Microsoft. She was saying, we actually caught a case where it did it. Luckily, it was a fake patient, but during the process, it had told during the cycle of the conversation, it had essentially implied to that fake patient, yeah, you should go ahead and do it. So it's not ready for clinical care. It's not going to take away, your ability to talk to somebody. It's just not there yet. It doesn't understand context. I had an exercise with my data science team as everyone was very excited about, OpenAI. And I said, okay, let's ask it about breast cancer and breast cancer screening. Let's go through and start asking the questions. So I open up the ChatGPT and say, I'm a 44-year-old female. Should I get a mammogram? And I get an answer. And then I go, okay, well, can you give me the guidelines? And then it gives me the guidelines. And the guidelines are slightly different from what it told me I should do. Mm-hmm. And then I said, well, wait, you told me to do this, but now the guidelines say contradict that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. And it's like, wait a minute, you're speaking to me as though you're quote unquote human, but I didn't realize that, I'm sorry. And you're apologetic and showing some level of empathy, but you shouldn't be getting this wrong in the first place.
Right. And we're trained to actually ask the questions after that first question.
Exactly. Right.
To stratify risk.
Right. And you have to take a step back and think, now, who would the user be if I was that patient saying I'm a 44, would I actually have the health literacy or digital literacy to continue to ask questions? In the overwhelming majority of the population, the answer is no, right? So I think that's a key piece that we have to think about as we're building these tools, as we're utilizing, we're going to, organizations that we all are in are going to start adopting these tools. We have to think about that. And the other thing we have to think about is security, is if you're putting your company or your employer, hospital, clinic, whatever it is, data into OpenAI, you've now just made it public. And it's at reach. It could be, breached. It could be accessed by somebody else. An employee at Samsung just did this like 2 weeks ago, where they dumped a bunch of sensitive information about Samsung onto OpenAI to ask it a question, and now it's all out. So I think it's exciting. There's a lot of chatter. But I think you should proceed with caution.
Pump the brakes.
Yeah, pump the brakes a little bit. Think critically. Make sure you're asking the right questions. How you word a question is very important. And that could be difficult for anybody, especially if English is your second language. If your education levels, don't always believe what you get. Think about it, go into a text.
I have to thank you. I mean, first of all, all the work that you do for the PA profession has been really admirable. And being a preceptor, being an educator, being on the NCCPA board, writing folks, the writing work groups, but then to also be inclusive of us as a profession in the care that you provide your patients, and also in thinking about the use case for AI and inclusive of PAs and NPs down the road. It's really wonderful. And we're very grateful for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And, I have strong love for PAs. My wife's a PA. Number of family members are PAs. I got a lot of friends who are PAs. Yeah, I love the model. I believe in the model. I think it's, we work better together.
Before we sign off, I just wanted to share a couple things. One is, as I alluded to early last week, we have passed 20,000 downloads for this podcast. And Stephanie and I are incredibly grateful to all of you, our listeners, for being part of that and joining us on this journey to hear about the PA profession, about PA programs, and learn about healthcare from the lens of our profession. I was reflecting in our conversation with Dr. Bakshandeh because he has been a strong ally for the profession. He's gotten involved beyond just precepting or teaching or supervising or collaborating with PAs. He actually has helped the NCCPA as a thought leader with their test writing work group, as you heard. It made me realize that sometimes it's helpful for us to stop and reflect and look at the people around us who lift us up, who have taken risks for us early on in my career. My physician colleagues took risks on having a PA in the practice and at the hospital. And without those allies early on, we wouldn't be where we're at. And I recognize that many of us have earned that through hard work, dedication, compassion, and team-based practice, but still it helps. And so I just thought it would be important to thank him for that and thank the people around us who continue to lift us up rather than tear us down. I also want to say hello to my AAPA colleagues and all of my PA colleagues who are in attendance at the American Academy of PA's 2023 meeting in Nashville. They're staying at the Music City Center and learning all about the profession, about evidence-based medicine, about policy, and so many other valuable insights that they're going to gain. I hope you all have a wonderful week there. Sorry I can't be there with you, but we look forward to hearing all about it. We want to thank Dr. Arta Bakshandeh for his time and insights into artificial intelligence and its impact in medicine and in PA education. There is much to see coming down the pike related to this topic. Tune in next week as we speak with Dr. Christopher Hannafin, the department chair and assistant professor at the Seton Hall University Department of Physician Assistant. Dr. Hannafin talks about his path to becoming a PA in cardiothoracic surgery, as well as becoming a PA educator, director, and national leader. Until next time, we wish you success with whatever path you're walking in life, and thank you for joining us. The purpose of this podcast is to provide news and information on the PA profession and is for informational purposes only. The views and perspectives expressed on this podcast are those of the speakers and guests and do not necessarily reflect the positions or policies of the University of Arizona.